On August 28, 1976, the crew of the American frigate USS Voge was enjoying a dead calm sunny afternoon in the Mediterranean. Sailors were sunbathing on the weather deck. No battle stations, no alarms. But just below the surface, a 5,700-ton Soviet submarine was tearing through the water at 17 knots, fully loaded with nuclear-capable cruise missiles. The K-22 was a highly lethal machine, but on this patrol, the real threat wasn't in the missile tubes, it was in the command chair. Captain Second Rank Nikolai Maximov was ignoring his instruments. He was ignoring his officers. The K-22 crew later described him as erratic and possibly under the influence. Within 2 hours, his recklessness would cause him to ram an American warship in broad daylight. This is the story of the K-22 and Voge collision. To understand how a nuclear submarine sneaks up on an American frigate, you have to realize that it wasn't sneaking at all. It was stumbling. By August 1976, the Mediterranean was a Cold War powder keg. The U.S. Sixth Fleet and the Soviet Fifth Eskadra were locked in a relentless game of tracking, shadowing, and acoustic cat-and-mouse. Just 3 years earlier, during the Yom Kippur War, the two navies had come dangerously close to open fire in these same waters. Every sonar contact, every periscope sighting was treated like a possible first move. On August 28th, that game was about to go badly wrong. K-22 was an Echo II-class guided missile submarine. She was not designed for close-quarters knife fights. Project 675M submarines were notoriously loud. Displacing 5,760 tons submerged, they were essentially underwater freight trains. Like many Soviet submarines, K-22 used a double-hull design, a thick inner pressure hull surrounded by a lighter outer casing. 8 P-6 cruise missiles sat in massive external containers mounted between those hulls. These containers disrupted the hydrodynamic flow of the water, creating acoustic drag that American sonar could hear from miles away. 2 pressurized water nuclear reactors drove 2 shafts, giving the Echo II a submerged speed of up to 22 knots. The American frigates USS Moinester and USS Voge were part of the force tracking K-22 in the sector. Voge was a Garcia-class frigate, roughly 3,400 tons, powered by a single steam turbine driving a single propeller. Moinester was a Knox-class frigate, heavier at about 4,100 tons, also single shaft. Both were ASW specialists. Neither was built to absorb a kinetic collision with a 5,700-ton nuclear submarine. But at 4:28 p.m., the Soviet commander spotted the Moinester through his periscope. Standard doctrine dictated evasion. Maximov decided he wanted to play. He ordered the submarine to close the distance for a training exercise. But he didn't call battle stations. He ordered his crew not to keep the logbook. He ignored his navigator's calculations and refused to use the Combat Information Center. Instead, he chose to calculate the intercept geometry by eye. Estimating range through a periscope without radar or acoustic triangulation is a mathematical gamble. Maximov visually estimated the Moinester at 40 to 50 cables, roughly 5 miles. The actual distance was 20 cables. He was off by more than 50%. His first officer tried to intervene. He was dismissed. Maximov was in his own world. He took the dive. Aboard the USS Voge, the Americans were watching a comedy unfold. For nearly 2 hours, the Voge had K-22 dead to rights. The Soviet submarine kept surfacing to periscope depth, popping its eye out of the water. It was so close that American sailors were leaning over the rails, snapping souvenir photographs. One sailor would later recall getting a sunburn that day. It was that calm, that peaceful. The Americans assumed it was a deliberate show of force, a calculated game of Cold War cat and mouse. They didn't realize the Soviet captain had no idea the Voge was even there. Maximov was completely fixated on the Moinester in the distance. By maneuvering erratically and constantly changing speeds, Maximov was destroying his own boat's acoustics. At 6:15 p.m., Maximov lost sight of the Moinester entirely. He was now a deaf, blind, 5,700-ton bullet flying through the layer at 17 knots. 10 minutes later, he raised the periscope one last time, and the horizon was gone. 6:25 p.m. The periscope broke the surface. Instead of empty horizon, Maximov was staring directly at the steel wall of the USS Voge. He snapped the handles up. Emergency dive. Inertia is absolute. On the bridge of the Voge, the American captain saw the black sail of the Soviet submarine erupt from the sea. There were no alarms, just a cold, instantaneous command. All back emergency. 1 minute later, the momentum won. K-22 slammed into the port quarter of the American frigate. The submarine's bow crushed into the hull directly under the helicopter hangar. Then the massive sail raked along the American steel with brutal force. But the Voge had one last weapon, its propeller. The frigate's massive bronze propeller was spinning at maximum reverse RPM. As the submarine slid underneath the stern, the propeller blades chopped directly into K-22's missile container number 1. Bronze alloy clashed with Soviet steel. The propeller disintegrated into yellow shrapnel. Several American sailors were thrown overboard. Helicopters later pulled them from the sea. The Voge lost all propulsion. Silence fell over the Ionian Sea. The Soviet submarine had done serious structural damage to the frigate's stern, wrecked her propeller, and left her dead in the water. Damage control teams went to work immediately, and the crew reported no panic. On K-22, the submarine surfaced and the crew began emergency damage assessments. The K-22's hydroacoustic antennas had been smashed. Its radar was destroyed. But the most terrifying damage was to missile container number 1. The American propeller had chewed into the housing. Seawater was pouring into the cavity of the missile launcher at a rate of 2 to 3 tons per hour. Inside that launcher was a P-6 Shaddock, a 5-ton nuclear-capable cruise missile built with one specific purpose: vaporizing American aircraft carriers. Had the bronze propeller cut just a few inches deeper, it could have breached the missile's fuel tanks or the warhead casing, triggering a radiological disaster. The Americans broadcast the collision on open channels. Within hours, the Soviet command cruiser Zhdanov and the large anti-submarine ship Smekli raced to the scene. When the Soviet rescue crew arrived, they found the K-22's sailors exhausted and pale white, standing on deck in light green uniforms. They looked like men who had just survived a high-speed car crash. The squadron commander and a KGB Ossibist boarded the crippled K-22 and later reported finding Captain Maximov in a state of psychological prostration. But judging by the photo, Maximov looked somewhat pleased. Russian naval stories kept the rumor alive for decades. His erratic maneuvers, his refusal to use the log, and his isolation of the bridge crew were the actions of a man whose judgment was compromised. Embedded directly in the torn metal of his sail was a massive yellow chunk of the Voge's shattered propeller. It was a humiliating bronze trophy of his recklessness. Fortunately, despite the violence of the collision, no lives were lost on either side. The Voge had to be towed to Crete and eventually to Toulon, France, costing the U.S. Navy an estimated $600,000 at the time. The Americans later presented a bill. Nothing came of it. In many navies, such a collision would likely have ended a commander's career, but Maximov had powerful patrons in Moscow, and the incident was quietly buried. He wasn't sent to a penal battalion. He was quietly transferred to a desk job as the deputy chief of staff of a flotilla in Gromyka, supposedly to teach tactics to young officers. According to some later Russian naval accounts, he was reportedly intoxicated. Others simply describe a commander suffering from arrogance and target fixation. K-22 limped home on the surface. She would serve for another 18 years. But the men of the USS Voge never forgot the sunny afternoon when the Cold War almost ended in a radiological catastrophe, all because a Soviet captain reportedly had one too many. History is built on human error. To explore more of the engineering failures and near misses the Cold War tried to bury, drop a like and hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.